The decision that shook a community. Johnny Whitmore stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city lights blinked like scattered diamonds against the dark velvet of the night. A cold breeze carried with it the distant hum of car horns and the echo of laughter from below. Sounds of life, of families enjoying the night, a world he was no longer a part of. In his hands, he held a worn-out picture frame, his fingers tracing the edges like a ritual. It was the last photo he had taken of his daughter, Emily, before leukemia stole her away. Her blonde hair was pulled into a ponytail, her bright blue eyes filled with the endless wonder only a child could possess. 5 years had passed since that day, yet the pain in Johnny's chest never faded. It was a wound that refused to heal. Wealth meant nothing when it couldn't save the one person you loved most. He sighed and set the frame back on his desk, glancing at another set of photos, the ones he had picked up earlier that day at the Children's Hope foster home. 7 faces, 7 girls, all sisters, all abandoned by the world. Mrs. Martinez, the foster home director, had hesitated before handing him the folder. "They're a special case, Mr. Whitmore. No one wants to adopt them all together. They don't want to separate, and we don't have the heart to force them." Johnny had met them by chance. During his visit to the charity-run home, his eyes had been drawn to the courtyard where the girls played. They were laughing as they jumped rope, their voices filling the empty space with a melody of pure joy. He had seen something in them, something familiar. Loss. They laughed, but their eyes carried the weight of too many goodbyes, of too many doors closed in their faces. And now, those girls were staring back at him from the photos spread across his desk. 7 young souls, ranging from 5 to 13, each with a different story, but the same uncertain future. Johnny ran a hand through his dark brown hair, exhaling sharply. "What would you say, Emily?" he whispered, his gaze drifting back to her picture. "Would you want 7 sisters?" A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His butler, a graying man named Thomas, stepped inside. "Sir, your attorney is on the line," he announced. "I believe it's about the matter you discussed earlier." Johnny nodded and picked up the phone. "James?" His lawyer's voice came through with a mixture of surprise and concern. "You're really going through with this?" Johnny's grip on the receiver tightened. "Yes." "Johnny, you do realize the backlash this is going to cause, don't you?" James hesitated. "You're a wealthy, single white man adopting 7 black girls. The media is going to have a field day. Your business partners, your investors, they're going to ask questions. Not to mention the community you live in." "I know," Johnny said, cutting him off. He had already considered all of that. The scrutiny, the whispers, the doubts. But this isn't about them. This is about those girls. A long pause. Then James sighed. "All right. Then let's get started on the paperwork. But Johnny, be ready. This won't be easy." Johnny hung up, his heart pounding. It didn't matter if it wasn't easy. He had already made his choice. The announcement that rocked the elite society. It took 3 months of home studies, legal documents, interviews, and psychological evaluations before the final papers were signed. 3 months of proving he wasn't some reckless billionaire on a whim. 3 months of convincing social workers that his motives were pure. 3 months of scrutiny, as whispers spread like wildfire among his elite social circle. Then the announcement came. Johnny Whitmore, a man known for his multimillion-dollar investments, luxury cars, and high society events, was now the legal guardian of 7 black sisters. The media couldn't get enough of it. Eccentric billionaire adopts 7 girls, philanthropy or publicity stunt. From bachelor to father of 7, what's Johnny Whitmore's endgame? Community outrage. Business mogul brings foster children into their elite neighborhood. And of course, the comments from his so-called peers were no less vicious. He's ruining the Whitmore name. 7 of them. Is he trying to make a statement? Poor girls. They'll never fit in. Even at his own country club, where he had once been welcomed with open arms, people suddenly had very little to say to him. He wasn't invited to the annual winter gala. Golf buddies who used to shake his hand now found reasons to turn away. But Johnny didn't care. He had only one thing on his mind: preparing his home for his daughters. 7 rooms, 7 custom-designed spaces, each tailored to the personalities he had come to know through conversations at the foster home. Pink and purple walls for little Tessa, who loved princesses. A bookshelf-filled haven for Jasmine, who devoured books faster than anyone he'd met. A sports-themed room for Maya, the eldest, who had a passion for basketball. Johnny wanted to give them everything they had been denied for so long. And finally, the day arrived. The social worker's car pulled into his long, circular driveway. 7 little faces peered out of the windows, eyes filled with apprehension and excitement. When the door opened, Maya stepped out first, her protective instincts in full force as she helped her younger sisters. Johnny took a deep breath and stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Welcome home." The words felt heavier than he expected. He saw the hesitation in their eyes, the way they clutched their small bags like shields. "Is this all yours?" Kira, the second youngest, asked in awe, looking up at the massive mansion. "No," Johnny corrected with a smile. "It's ours now. All of ours." For the first time, the weight in his heart lifted. This was their beginning, a beginning that would shake the very foundation of the world around them. But Johnny was ready. Because nothing, not whispers, not scandal, not prejudice, would take this family from him. A home of their own. Johnny Whitmore had always thought of his home as a masterpiece, an architectural marvel filled with the finest furniture, imported chandeliers, and art pieces worth millions. But now, standing at the grand entrance of his mansion, watching the 7 girls cautiously step through the doorway, he realized how empty it had been. Until now. Maya, the eldest at 13, kept a protective grip on little Tessa's hand, her dark brown eyes scanning the massive space with suspicion. Rachel, 11, bit her lower lip, uncertain. Jasmine, 10, peeked around cautiously as if expecting someone to tell them they didn't belong. And Johnny couldn't blame them. They had spent years shuffled between foster homes, never staying in one place long enough to feel safe. But that was over. "Would you like a tour?" he asked, forcing himself to keep his voice casual. He had spent weeks preparing, wanting everything to be perfect. The girls exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Maya squared her shoulders. "Yeah, I guess." Johnny smiled, motioning for them to follow. The moment they stepped into the living room, Jasmine gasped. "You got books." Her wide eyes landed on the built-in shelves, stacked from floor to ceiling with novels, encyclopedias, and storybooks. She ran toward them before hesitating, her hands hovering over a thick hardcover. "Can I touch them?" Johnny's chest ached at the question. "These books are yours now," he said. "Read as many as you want." Jasmine let out a delighted squeal and immediately pulled out a copy of A Wrinkle in Time, clutching it like a treasure. They moved to the kitchen next, where the marble countertops gleamed under the golden lights. The fridge was stocked with fresh fruit, snacks, and homemade meals prepared by his chef, Mrs. Owens. "You can have anything you want, whenever you want," Johnny assured them. "There's no schedule here. No waiting for permission to eat." Little Tessa, barely 5 years old, stared up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Even cereal?" Johnny chuckled. "Even cereal." By the time they reached the bedrooms, the girls' walls of hesitation had begun to crack. This is for me." Maya's voice was barely above a whisper as she stepped into her room, running her hands over the basketball-themed bedspread. A brand-new hoop was mounted on the wall beside a shelf filled with NBA memorabilia. Johnny nodded. "I heard you liked basketball." Maya swallowed hard. "Yeah, but no one ever cared before." She turned away quickly, but Johnny saw the glint of tears in her eyes. In the next room, Rachel gasped when she saw the large white desk by the window. Is that a computer? Brand new, Johnny confirmed. You can use it for homework, games, anything you like. I never had my own computer before. Her voice was soft, disbelieving. In Tessa's room, the walls were painted a soft lavender, and stuffed animals filled the bed. She climbed up onto the mattress, burying her face into a plush teddy bear. Kira, the second youngest, touched the soft fairy lights hanging above her bed and whispered, "It's like magic." One by one, each girl stepped into her space, eyes full of wonder. And for the first time since arriving, they started to believe. They had a home. A real home. A family in the making. The first week was an adjustment. The girls weren't used to sleeping in beds that belonged only to them. Some nights, they snuck into each other's rooms, curling up together like they had done in foster homes where they'd had to share tiny mattresses. Johnny would sometimes wake in the middle of the night to find one of them sitting in the hallway, afraid to be alone. "It's okay," he would whisper, gently leading them back to their beds. "You're safe here." Mornings were chaotic. At first, they were hesitant, expecting strict rules. They tiptoed through the house, unsure of what was allowed. But when Johnny encouraged them to speak up, to make choices for themselves, things changed. Maya and Jasmine would race to the kitchen in the mornings, competing over who could make the best pancake. Rachel started reading at the breakfast table, completely absorbed in whatever book she'd found. And Tessa followed Johnny everywhere, her tiny hands gripping the hem of his shirt, like she was afraid he would disappear. "Are you staying, Daddy?" she asked one night while he tucked her in. The word hit Johnny like a truck. She had never called him that before. He swallowed the lump in his throat and brushed her curly hair from her forehead. "I'm staying, sweetheart. Forever." The first challenge. The outside world was not as welcoming. Johnny knew adopting 7 black girls as a wealthy white man would raise eyebrows, but he had underestimated the hostility from his elite neighbors. It started with whispers. At the grocery store, people stared. At the country club, old friends suddenly stopped returning his calls. Then came the letters. Concerned citizens, as they called themselves, questioned whether Johnny was capable of raising 7 black girls. They used words like cultural differences and stability concerns. The worst came from the neighborhood association. Their letter was polite on the surface but dripping with venom. "Mr. Whitmore, while we respect your charitable actions, we must consider the impact on our community. A household of this nature may not align with our neighborhood's traditional values." In other words, they didn't want his daughters there. Johnny crumpled the letter in his fist. They would have to go through him first. The first attack. The backlash escalated when Johnny took his daughters to the annual neighborhood fall festival. At first, things seemed normal. The girls wandered through the booths, wide-eyed at the carnival games and pumpkin displays. Kira giggled as she got her face painted with butterflies. Then came the comments. A woman near the bake sale murmured to her friend, "Doesn't he know how this looks?" A man near the cider stand scoffed, "That they won't last a month." Johnny clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. But it was Rachel, his normally reserved bookworm, who finally lost her temper. She turned to face the crowd, her voice shaking with fury. "Why do you care so much? We're not hurting anyone." The festival went silent. People stared, some with embarrassment, others with hostility. Johnny stepped forward, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart," he said gently. "They don't deserve your energy." But he knew then. The fight had only just begun, and Johnny Whitmore wasn't backing down. The storm begins. Johnny Whitmore had built his life around calculated risks. He knew how to navigate billion-dollar investments, negotiate high-stakes deals, and manipulate markets to his advantage. But none of that had prepared him for the war he now found himself fighting, the war for his daughter's right to belong. Whispers turned to weapons. The first true attack came quietly, like a slow-moving storm creeping toward destruction. It began with something simple. Johnny walked into his office one morning and found his assistant pale-faced, holding up a document. "Sir, you need to see this." Johnny took the paper and scanned the heading. Petition for removal of non-traditional households from the Fairview Estates community. His jaw tightened as he read. The document listed fabricated complaints about disruptions in community harmony, increased safety concerns, and a decline in neighborhood standards. The petition had nearly 50 signatures, people Johnny had known for years, people who had shaken his hand at galas, toasted champagne with him at business functions, and sent holiday cards to his office. His own neighbors wanted him gone. He clenched his fist so tightly around the paper that it crumpled in his grasp. This wasn't just about property values. This was about his daughters, 7 innocent girls who had done nothing but exist. That night, as he sat at the dinner table with them, watching as Rachel enthusiastically talked about the book she was reading, as Maya laughed while Kira struggled to eat spaghetti without making a mess, Johnny made a decision. They wouldn't run. They wouldn't hide. They would fight. A dangerous warning. Johnny's defiance came at a cost. One evening, he returned home late after a meeting with his lawyer, James, who was preparing a counter-lawsuit against the neighborhood association. The moment he stepped out of his car, he smelled it. Burning. His heart slammed against his ribs. He sprinted up the driveway. Smoke curled from his front porch. His stomach dropped. Somebody had set a fire. A cross, the oldest, most hateful symbol of racism, burned on his pristine lawn. His hand shook as he grabbed the garden hose, dousing the flames until the embers hissed and died. By the time he turned, his girls were standing at the door, watching in horror. Tessa whimpered and clutched Maya's arm. Kira's tiny fists balled at her sides. Rachel had tears in her eyes. But it was Jasmine, quiet, bookish Jasmine, who spoke first. "They hate us," she whispered, voice trembling. Johnny knelt in front of them, his hands gripping Kira's shoulders gently. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They fear us, because we prove that love is stronger than hate." Maya swallowed hard. "But they're trying to scare us away." Johnny met her gaze. "Are we going anywhere?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, one by one, his daughters shook their heads. "No," Rachel said firmly. "No," Jasmine agreed. Johnny smiled through the anger burning inside him. "Then they've already lost. Battle lines are drawn." The attack was the final straw. Johnny's powerful name had always carried weight in business circles. But now, his resources weren't for profits. They were for war. He hired private security. He installed cameras around his property. And he called in every favor he had ever earned. Within 2 days, news outlets swarmed his neighborhood. Billionaire philanthropists, home targeted in hate crime. What's happening in Fairview Estates? Adoptive father of 7 speaks out. I will not be intimidated. Reporters crowded outside his gates, asking if he planned to leave. His response: I didn't adopt my daughters to teach them to run. I adopted them to teach them to stand. The story went viral. Social media erupted. Half the world was outraged on his behalf. The other half spewed hatred, calling him a white savior or accusing him of forcing integration where it wasn't wanted. But Johnny didn't care about opinions. He cared about justice. The courtroom showdown. When Johnny walked into the courtroom a week later, he wasn't alone. His 7 daughters sat in the front row, dressed in their best outfits, backs straight, eyes steady. The judge eyed them before turning to the representatives from the neighborhood association. What exactly are your concerns, gentlemen? A slick-haired man in an expensive suit stood. His name was Richard Calloway. Johnny had done business with him before. Now he was one of the people spearheading the petition. This isn't about race, Calloway said smoothly. It's about preserving the character of our community. The judge frowned. And what about the fire? The threats? The vandalism? Calloway's lips tightened. We had nothing to do with that. Convenient, Johnny muttered under his breath. James, his lawyer, stood next. "Your Honor," he said, "this petition is not about community standards. It is about racism. Plain and simple." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged her gavel. "Order in the court." James continued. "Mr. Whitmore has done nothing illegal. His daughters are thriving. They have higher grades than most children in this neighborhood. They volunteer. They contribute. And yet these people would rather burn a cross on his lawn than accept them." Maya squeezed Johnny's hand under the table. The judge turned to Calloway. "Do you have any proof that Mr. Whitmore has done anything to harm this community?" Calloway cleared his throat. "His presence has caused division. That is harm enough." The courtroom fell silent. Then the judge sighed. "I don't see any valid legal grounds to force Mr. Whitmore out of his home." She glared at Calloway. "This court does not serve the interests of bigotry." Case dismissed. The gavel slammed. The war wasn't over, but this battle belonged to Johnny and his daughters. The shift begins. The lawsuit was a victory, but it didn't erase the damage. The girls still faced discrimination at school. Parents still refused to let their children play with them. But something was changing. One by one, people started standing up. Mrs. Thompson, a local bakery owner, sent free pastries to Johnny's house. A high school teacher publicly defended the girls, saying they were some of the brightest students she had ever taught. A group of teenagers showed up one Saturday, volunteering to clean Johnny's lawn after vandals defaced it. And then, one evening, as Johnny sat on his porch, watching his daughters play basketball in the driveway, a car pulled up. Calloway stepped out. Johnny tensed. "What do you want?" The older man hesitated. "My grandson," he muttered, avoiding Johnny's gaze. He keeps talking about your daughters. Says they helped him with school." Johnny waited. Calloway sighed, running a hand over his face. "I was wrong." Johnny didn't say anything. But as Calloway turned to leave, he noticed something new. The storm wasn't over, but the clouds were starting to break. Unbreakable bonds. The weight of the war. Johnny Whitmore had spent his life fighting battles in corporate boardrooms, winning high-stakes negotiations, and coming out on top of billion-dollar deals. But this was the hardest fight of his life. The lawsuit had been won, but victory hadn't brought peace. The girls were still ostracized. Parents still pulled their children away when they walked into the neighborhood park. Schools still treated them like outsiders. The local grocery store still went silent whenever they entered. The burning cross on his lawn might have been extinguished, but the fire of hatred still burned all around them. And Johnny was exhausted. Late at night, when the girls were asleep, he sat in his study, staring at spreadsheets that reflected the consequences of his fight. His business was suffering. Longtime investors were pulling out. Partners he had worked with for years were suddenly too busy to return his calls. Deals that should have been easy were falling apart under the weight of his reputation. The world was watching, and not everyone wanted him to win. James, his lawyer, had warned him this would happen. "You're challenging something bigger than just a neighborhood, Johnny," he had said. "You're challenging an entire system." But Johnny didn't care about systems. He cared about his daughters. He cared about making sure they knew, without a doubt, that he would never abandon them. That this was their home. Forever. The silent battle. The real war wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the little things, like how Maya came home from basketball practice one day and threw her sneakers in the corner. Johnny noticed the tension in her shoulders. "What happened?" She hesitated before answering. "Coach benched me." Johnny frowned. "Why? You're the best player on the team." Maya shrugged. "He said I needed to work on my team attitude, but I know what it's really about." Johnny clenched his fists under the table. It was happening everywhere. Jasmine had a perfect book report mysteriously disappear. Rachel wasn't invited to a classmate's birthday party, even though every other girl in her grade was. Kira's art project was torn to shreds in the school hallway, and when she told a teacher, the response was, "Maybe you should have kept it in your locker." It wasn't loud discrimination. It was silent, subtle, insidious, and it was eating away at his daughters. Johnny's breaking point. One night, Johnny found Tessa curled up on the couch, staring at the flickering TV screen. She wasn't watching. She was just staring. Tessa. He sat beside her. She didn't look at him. Why does everyone hate us? His heart shattered. He pulled her onto his lap, wrapping his arms around her tiny frame. They don't hate you, sweetheart. She turned, her dark brown eyes full of tears. Then why don't they talk to us? Why do they look at us like we're bad? Johnny swallowed the lump in his throat. How did you explain hatred to a 5-year-old? How did you tell her that some people would never see her as enough, no matter how kind, smart, or talented she was? He kissed the top of her head. Some people are scared of what they don't understand. And sometimes, scared people act mean. Tessa sniffled. Will they ever stop? Johnny wanted to say yes. But he had learned the hard way that the world didn't change just because you wanted it to. So instead, he told her the truth. Maybe not, but that doesn't matter, because we don't live for them. We live for us. Tessa wrapped her little arms around his neck, and Johnny held her tight, silently vowing that he would fix this. Taking back their power, Johnny knew he couldn't change people's minds overnight, but he could change the way his daughters saw themselves. He gathered them in the living room the next day. We're going to start something new, he announced. The girls exchanged wary glances. What? Maya asked, crossing her arms. Some inspirational speech. Johnny smirked. No, a legacy. Rachel perked up. A what? A legacy, Johnny repeated. Something that proves we don't just exist in this town. We own it. He spread out blueprints on the coffee table. The girls leaned in, their curiosity piqued. We're going to build something together, Johnny said. Something ours. Project Hope Haven. Within weeks, Johnny and his daughters launched a community initiative, Hope Haven. It started small. Weekend food drives, school supply giveaways, tutoring programs for struggling students. The first event drew only 5 people. The second event drew 15. By the third, people were talking. They weren't just the outsiders anymore. They were the helpers. The girls found their own ways to contribute. Maya started a basketball clinic for underprivileged kids. Jasmine set up a mobile library, bringing books to children who couldn't afford them. Rachel, with her love of tech, created a website for their mission. And slowly, ever so slowly, people started showing up. One night, Johnny received a call from Mrs. Peterson, the same woman who had once refused to let her daughter play with his girls. Mr. Whitmore, she said hesitantly, I was wondering if my son could attend your tutoring program. Johnny almost laughed. Instead, he said, of course, because change wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about showing them another way. The shift no one saw coming. The momentum of Hope Haven was unstoppable. By the time the 1-year anniversary rolled around, the mayor himself attended their fundraiser. The same neighbors who had once whispered about Johnny were now shaking his hand, praising his daughters, acting as if they had never been part of the problem. One by one, the dominoes fell. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had crossed the street to avoid them, donated $10,000 to their cause. Mr. Wilson, the old man who had once muttered about troublemakers, volunteered to help with their after-school program. And Calloway, the man who had led the charge to have them removed from the neighborhood. He sent a letter. Not a threat, not a demand. A thank you for helping his grandson, for proving him wrong, for teaching him what family really meant, a home built on love. One evening, Johnny and his daughters sat around a bonfire in their backyard, roasting marshmallows and laughing as Kira got sticky chocolate all over her face. For the first time in 2 years, Johnny felt something settle deep in his bones. Peace. Maya nudged him. You did it, Dad. Johnny raised an eyebrow. Did what? She gestured around. This. All of this. Johnny shook his head. We did it. Tessa crawled into his lap, sighing contentedly. Does this mean we won? Johnny gazed at his daughters. His brave, unbreakable, unstoppable daughters. We were never fighting to win, he said softly. We were fighting to belong. Jasmine smiled. And now we do. Johnny grinned. Yeah, he said. Now we do. The storm before the calm. Even with the victory stacking up, Johnny knew better than to believe the war was over. Progress was slow. The community was beginning to see his daughters not as outsiders, but as fixtures of the town, leaders, mentors, and contributors. Yet there were still those who held on to their prejudices with white-knuckled grips, unwilling to let go of their ingrained beliefs. And those people were dangerous. It started small, like always. A slashed tire here, a vandalized wall there, a note left in their mailbox. You'll never be one of us. Johnny shrugged it off. He had learned to expect resistance when pushing for change. But then, the threats became real. One night, after a long day of organizing a fundraiser for Hope Haven, Johnny and the girls arrived home to find their front windows shattered. Glass littered the floor. A brick lay on the carpet, a crudely scrawled note attached. Get out. Johnny's blood ran cold. His daughter stood frozen behind him, eyes wide with shock. Tessa clutched his pant leg. Daddy, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jasmine looked around, her small body shaking. Why? Why would someone do this? Johnny turned to them, keeping his voice steady. Because they're scared of what we represent. Maya clenched her fists. We didn't do anything wrong. No, Johnny agreed, his jaw tightening. But change scares people. And when people are scared, they lash out. Rachel bent down and picked up a piece of glass, her expression unreadable. Should we call the police? Johnny hesitated. What would the police really do? File a report and call it a day? No. They had to fight differently. The turning point. Instead of hiding, Johnny made a statement. The very next morning, he invited the press to his house. Let them see the broken windows. Let them see the hateful note. Let them see exactly what his daughters were fighting against. When reporters arrived, Johnny stood before them, his daughters standing strong beside him. This isn't about me, he said, gesturing to the damage behind him. This is about what my daughters stand for. And clearly, some people don't like that. A journalist stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, are you saying this was a racially motivated attack? Johnny's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm saying this was a cowardly attack, and we don't respond to cowards with fear. Jasmine, standing by his side, lifted her chin. We respond by showing up, by working harder, by proving that nothing they do can break us. The clip aired nationwide. By noon, their story was trending on social media. #StandWithTheWhitmore7. Donations poured into Hope Haven. Messages of support flooded in. People across the country, even those who had never met them, began to take notice. And just like that, the town had a choice. They could either stand with their own, or be exposed as the hateful, exclusionary community the world now saw them as. The shift happened almost overnight. A team of volunteers showed up at their home to replace the broken windows. Local businesses began offering discounts to Hope Haven patrons. Parents who had once ignored Johnny and his daughters at school events suddenly wanted to schedule playdates. And the neighborhood. The same people who had petitioned to have them removed now tried to pretend that they had been supportive all along. Johnny wasn't naive. He knew not all change was sincere. Some people only stood by them because they didn't want to be seen as the enemy. But others had genuinely changed. And that, to Johnny, was the only victory that mattered. Hope in the eyes of the future. Months passed. The wounds healed. The house was repaired. But more importantly, his daughters healed. One evening, Johnny sat on the front porch, watching the sunset with Tessa curled up on his lap. The other girls were in the yard, laughing as Maya taught Kira how to dribble a basketball. Johnny smiled. This was what they had fought for. "Daddy?" Tessa's tiny voice broke the peaceful silence. Johnny looked down at her. "Yeah, sweetheart." She tilted her head up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think they'll always hate us?" Johnny exhaled slowly. "No, baby," he said softly, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Because hate is weak. Love is strong." Tessa yawned, her small fingers clutching his shirt. "We're strong, too." Johnny smiled. "Yeah, sweetheart, we're the strongest." As the sky darkened, he held his daughter close, listening to the laughter of his family echo through the warm evening air. The war wasn't over. There would always be people who resisted change, who hated without cause, who tried to break them. But Johnny knew one thing for certain. They had built something that could never be broken. And that was a legacy no one could take away. Rising from the ashes, the world had changed around them. The community that had once tried to erase them was now singing their praises. The same people who had whispered behind their backs now wanted to be part of their lives. But Johnny Whitmore knew better. He knew that not all smiles were genuine, that not all apologies came from the heart, and that deep down there were still some who wished he and his daughters would disappear. But they wouldn't. They had built something unshakable. And now it was time to rise even higher. Hope Haven grows. The success of Hope Haven had exceeded even Johnny's expectations. What had started as a simple food drive had grown into a full-fledged foundation. Tutoring programs, scholarships for underprivileged kids, workshops for single parents. And then the big one. Johnny had purchased an old community center that had been abandoned for years. It sat on the outskirts of town, forgotten, broken, covered in graffiti and overgrown weeds. But Johnny saw something in it. He saw potential. This, he told his daughters one afternoon, as they stood in front of the crumbling brick walls, is going to be the new home of Hope Haven. The girls stared at him, wide-eyed. "You mean, like a real building?" Jasmine asked. "A real place," Rachel whispered. "A place people can go every day," Maya added. Johnny nodded. Kira, the youngest, bounced excitedly. "Can we paint it?" He chuckled. "Yes, Kira, we can paint it." And just like that, the project began. They cleaned out the debris. They'd hired workers. They designed classrooms, recreational areas, counseling spaces. And before long, Hope Haven wasn't just an idea. It was a sanctuary. Enemies in the shadows. But success always had its enemies. The more Hope Haven grew, the more it became a symbol that the old ways were dying. And not everyone was ready for that. One evening, as Johnny locked up the center for the night, he heard the sound of footsteps. He turned, eyes scanning the dark alley beside the building. Someone was there, watching, waiting. And then, a voice. "You should have left when you had the chance." Johnny's pulse spiked. He took a step forward, his hands curling into fists. "You got something to say. Say it to my face." The shadowy figure didn't move, didn't speak, and then they disappeared. Johnny exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. This wasn't over. They had won battles. But the war was still being fought in the shadows. Maya's breaking point. Maya had always been the strongest, the protector, the one who stood tall no matter what. But even the strongest can break. It happened on a Friday. Johnny had just finished making breakfast when he heard a door slam upstairs. Loud, violent. Then came the sound of something shattering. His heart pounded as he ran up the stairs. Maya's room. He knocked. "Maya, are you okay?" No answer. He knocked again. "Sweetheart, open the door." Still nothing. Finally, he pushed the door open. And what he saw broke him. Maya stood in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face, fists clenched, breathing hard. The mirror was cracked. The bookshelves were in disarray. Her basketball lay forgotten in the corner. Johnny stepped inside carefully. "Maya, talk to me." Her chest heaved. "I'm tired, Dad." His heart clenched at the word. Dad. She rarely called him that. He sat on the bed, keeping his voice gentle. "I know, sweetheart. But tell me what happened." She swallowed, her eyes glassy with pain. "They still hate us." Johnny's stomach dropped. "Who?" Maya ran a hand through her curly hair, frustrated. "People at school. The coach. The other players. No matter how good I am, no matter how hard I work, they still treat me like I don't belong." Johnny felt a familiar rage simmer inside him. "But you do belong, Maya," he said, his voice steady. "You always have." She let out a bitter laugh. "Do I? Because some days it sure doesn't feel like it." Johnny reached for her hand. "Maya, listen to me." She didn't pull away. "This world is going to try to tell you who you are," he said softly. "It's going to try to make you doubt yourself, make you feel small. But the only voice that matters is yours." Maya blinked back tears. "What if my voice isn't loud enough?" Johnny squeezed her hand. "Then we'll make it louder." Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Maya nodded. And Johnny knew she wasn't broken. She was just learning to fight in a different way. The unveiling of Hope Haven. The grand opening of Hope Haven was an event the town would never forget. People came from everywhere. Former doubters, longtime supporters, families in need. The mayor spoke. Local businesses donated. And Johnny stood with his daughters in front of the newly renovated building, watching as they cut the ribbon together. This place, he told the crowd, was built on love, on resilience, on the belief that no matter who you are, you deserve a chance. Applause erupted. Tessa tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, does this mean we won?" Johnny chuckled, lifting her into his arms. "Sweetheart, this isn't about winning." She frowned. "Then what's it about?" He smiled, looking around at the people who had once turned their backs on them, now standing with them. "It's about making a world where we don't have to fight just to exist," he said. Jasmine grinned. "And I think we did that." Johnny looked at his daughters, his family, the girls who had once been unwanted, unwelcome, treated like they were less. Now, they were the heartbeat of this town. And no one could ever take that from them. As the crowd cheered, as Hope Haven officially opened its doors, Johnny felt something deeper than pride. He felt peace. They had built something that would outlive them. A legacy, a home, a future. And for the first time in his life, Johnny Whitmore knew this was where he was always meant to be. A legacy that cannot be broken. 1 year later, a full year had passed since Hope Haven opened its doors. A full year since the community had been forced to recognize Johnny Whitmore and his daughters not as outcasts, but as pioneers. In that year, everything had changed. People who had once whispered behind their backs now greeted them with smiles. Parents who had once kept their children away were now asking for playdates. The same schools that had dismissed them now invited Johnny to speak about inclusivity, leadership, and resilience. Hope Haven had grown beyond their wildest dreams. It had become a sanctuary for those who had never felt like they belonged. And yet, despite all the victories, despite all the progress, Johnny wasn't satisfied. Because he wasn't just fighting for his daughters. He was fighting for every child who had ever been told they weren't enough. The final threat. Change had come, but so had resentment. Not everyone was happy with what Johnny and his daughters had built. Late one evening, as Johnny finished locking up Hope Haven, he saw a familiar figure waiting in the parking lot. Richard Calloway, the man who had once tried to force them out of the neighborhood. The man who had called Johnny's daughters a disruption. Johnny sighed, adjusting his coat. "What do you want, Calloway?" The older man hesitated, then stepped forward. "I came to warn you." Johnny raised an eyebrow. "Warn me?" Calloway nodded. There are people in this town who aren't done fighting you, Whitmore. They don't like what you've built. Johnny crossed his arms. And what? They think I'm just going to pack up and leave. Calloway exhaled, looking uncomfortable. They aren't going to stop at words this time. Johnny's entire body tensed. For a moment, he imagined his daughters. Maya, running drills on the basketball court. Rachel, lost in a book. Tessa, curling up on his lap. He thought about the hate mail, the threats, the vandalism, the burning cross on his lawn. And then he thought about the people Hope Haven had saved, the lives they had changed. He took a step closer to Calloway. You listen to me, he said, his voice calm but firm. I don't scare easy, and I sure as hell don't back down. Calloway swallowed hard. I had a feeling you'd say that. He turned to leave, but before he could, Johnny called out. Why do you care? Calloway hesitated. Then, without turning back, he muttered, Because I was wrong about you. Then he was gone. Johnny stood in the cold night air, fists clenched, heart racing. A storm was coming. And this time, Johnny would be ready. The night that changed everything. It happened 3 nights later. A single phone call. A panicked voice on the other end. Mr. Whitmore, Hope Haven, it's on fire. Johnny's blood ran cold. He tore out of the house, ignoring the pounding in his chest as he jumped into his car and raced through the streets. When he arrived, flames were already licking the walls of the building he and his daughters had built with their own hands. Firefighters were already battling the inferno, but Johnny barely saw them. All he saw was everything they had worked for, turning to ash. His daughters arrived minutes later. Maya skidded to a stop beside him, breathless. No, she whispered, staring at the blaze. Jasmine clutched Rachel's hand, tears streaming down her face. Tessa buried her face in Johnny's side, sobbing. For a long time, no one spoke. They just stood there, watching as their dream, their legacy, burned. Then, finally, Rachel spoke. Why? She choked. Why would someone do this? Johnny took a slow breath, his hands shaking. Because they think they can erase us. Maya clenched her fists, her entire body trembling with rage. They think this will break us. Johnny turned to his daughters, his eyes blazing with determination. But they're wrong. Rising from the ashes, the fire had been an attack. A final desperate attempt to destroy what they had built. But Johnny and his daughters, they didn't break. They rebuilt. And this time, they made it even bigger. Donations poured in. Thousands of people from all over the country, people who had heard their story, people who had once doubted them, gave what they could. Within 6 months, Hope Haven stood again. And this time, it wasn't just a community center. It was a beacon, a reminder that no matter how much people try to erase them, they would not be moved. The future they created. Years later, when Maya was in college, she came home one weekend and found Johnny sitting on the front porch, staring at the sunset. She sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. You did it, Dad. Johnny smiled, wrapping an arm around her. We did it. She exhaled, watching the colors shift in the sky. Do you think they still hate us? She asked softly. Johnny didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around. At Hope Haven, now expanded into 3 different centers across the state. At the people in their town, who had once rejected them, but now embraced them. At the house that had once been silent and empty, but was now filled with laughter and love. Finally, he spoke. Some will, but that's not what matters. Maya lifted her head. What does? Johnny smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. That we proved them wrong. Maya grinned. Yeah, we did. And as they sat there, watching the sky turn gold and purple, Johnny knew their legacy would live forever. Because love always wins, no matter what.